It's time to start telling our own stories. I'm Steve Kellums, and welcome to Blue Canary. To help share the story of how law enforcement can deal with the stress is Stephanie Samuels with CopLine. Now, CopLine is a 24/7 hotline that officers can call for help working through problems and dealing with the associated emotional trauma faced as part of our profession. This help is not likely found at the station, and it's this help many may be afraid to ask for from their fellow officers. Stephanie is a psychotherapist and post-traumatic stress disorder expert who focuses on issues in law enforcement. She started her career as one of the founding members of Teen Line Cares, a teen hotline, and what she learned working with Teen Line was that teens would only talk to other teens. Now, that understanding stuck with her, and as she became heavily involved working with law enforcement, she realized that cops would only really talk to other cops. And she is currently the founder and president of CopLine Incorporated, the first confidential national law enforcement officers hotline in the country manned by retired officers. Her insights into the emotional issues and pressures felt by officers, coupled with what is currently going on in law enforcement, is fascinating. I found myself wishing I knew about CopLine when I was on the job. Stephanie, thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, Steve. Thank you so much for having me.
You know, the reason, as I said, that when I wanted to have you on, I wanted to talk about CopLine, what it is, when it started, where it came from, because unfortunately, there's a lot of cops out there that don't know anything about it.
So my background is I am a psychotherapist. I've been practicing for about 30 plus years, and most of which have been spent with law enforcement. So ended up, I was debating myself whether or not to be a police officer. I ended up riding. I grew up out in California, ended up riding, had a really wonderful experience with being able to ride with both LAPD and Los Angeles Sheriff's Department during the heyday of the gangs back in the 80s. Thought I really wanted to be a cop. Ended up really realizing that I didn't have what it took to be a cop. I did not believe that I had the heart that could go out there every day and do what was going to be needed. So I ended up back east, worked in the housing projects of Jacob Riis on 6th and D, more deaths on 6th and D than any other location in Manhattan. And when I was down there, we were funded by the Juvenile Justice Department and really worked with some of America's most wanted youth, as I lovingly refer to them as, but really ended up getting schooled on the D. And as time passed, I really realized, and I hope there's no offense that's taken, that kind of that when I was out in California, it's interesting. I had never met a gang member that didn't want to be a cop. And then I thought about that there really wasn't a cop that wasn't part of a gang, FOPs, PBAs, unions, but it's really a brotherhood. It's not the negative part of it. And I think that was kind of that connection. And I had never really, in all the law enforcement that I've dealt with, I can't tell you how many times they have said to me, there was a point in time I was either going to make a right-hand turn or a left-hand turn. And so I kind of looked at kind of their profiles. And after spending enough time down at the D, I moved out to Jersey and went to the police academy and had said to the director, who's dealing with, officers involved in shootings, untimely deaths? And he said, really no one. So that really began my quest to figure out how to get cops what they needed. So I began doing ride-alongs here in New Jersey. And it was really, really interesting to see the different stressors, because we've got departments that are 9-man departments that go from 1,200 in the winter to tens of thousands in the summer. But what I've really found unique, unlike the larger departments, was that many of these officers grew up in these areas, so that they were policing a place that they knew, they had grown up, they had emotional attachment to, but more importantly, that they knew everybody. So in California, if you're LAPD and if you get a call, most of the time it's just a John or Jane Doe. Well, in these smaller departments, these aren't John or Jane Does. This is, Aunt Betty who used to bake me brownies. This is, Aunt Betty's best friend who, used to walk me to school. So these were typically emotionally charged calls. And so looking at just these differences and realizing that what these men and women had gone through and continue to go through is just, it takes a toll. That people falsely believe somehow or another that cops are wired differently, that they can handle this, and fill in the word this with anything, with a fatal motor vehicle accident of a child, with bad burns, with heart attacks, with, it doesn't make a difference. And so when I would ride with these guys, and I'd ride full shift. So for about the first 2 hours, 3 hours, they are very formal, very kind of rigid. And between my language and just kind of realizing that I'm going to be there for a while, something shifts and they begin to open up. And it was just so rewarding to be able to understand. But I really knew that cops only wanted to talk to cops.
As Stephanie paints a vivid picture of how she came to build CopLine, I asked her to delve deeper into how it works and why cops don't seek out help naturally.
So one of the bigger pieces was to be what we call a non-rescue line. And what that means, it does not mean that we will not do everything in our power to get an officer help if they are actively suicidal. However, one needs to understand that the reason why officers don't reach out for help is because they are scared that it's going to cost them their careers. They are scared that it's truly not confidential. So I will ask you, Steve, if I ping a phone or if I trace a call and I need to send somebody to a house, who am I sending to that person's house?
Oh, you're sending the cops, and you're sending the cops they're working with.
So if they're living in that area, it's who they're working with. If not, but you guys are like a bunch, I love you, but you guys are like a bunch of washroom women. So as soon as somebody shows up to Officer Bob Smith's house, the entire community at large is going to know. And so they're going to say, don't ever call CopLine. They can't be trusted. I just went to Bob Smith's house and man, that cost him his career, blah, blah, blah. So I was acutely aware that I was never going to do a rescue line, but really needed to get all the ducks in order. So by the time we went live, so the Pulse shooting was in June of 2016. And 3 weeks later was July 7th of 2016, which was the Dallas 5. And I got a call on my office line that really rattled me. I had started to undo the process of having it on my office phone and transferred to a separate cell phone that I had bought. So I knew that it would be a CopLine call when it came in.
So at that point in time, when you were answering phones, you didn't know if it was going to be a business call or a CopLine call.
Correct. So after the Dallas shooting, I got a call at the office that said it was a female officer who was sobbing, with just that heart-wrenching pain that nobody should ever have to both experience on either end. And she was screaming and she said, "You've got to help my brothers and sisters are killing my brothers and sisters. You've got to do something." And I remember just feeling so helpless, just like the rest of the country, and overwhelmed. And I remember thinking to myself, I can do something. Like, I've got to shit or get off the pot. So the lines were transferred to me. I sent out a request for people to help after that. But again, we were unadvertised, so that the chances of somebody finding us were really, really slim. As of in the middle of April of 2017, we had our first CopLine training. So my lead trainer is an amazing man. Dr. Jay Nagdeman has got a dual expertise. He's the only one in the country that I know of that has it. He is currently with the Los Angeles Police Department in their behavioral science services. LAPD could not be any more gracious than they are and truly supportive of CopLine. But before he was with LAPD, he actually was the director of the Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Hotline, the oldest hotline in the United States. So they've been around since 1963. So here's where these stats come from, which is imperative to know. So since 1963, I think I was able to get data through 18 because it takes sometimes a year to get the data, that they have fielded over 7,500,000 calls, of which 2 people have died by suicide on the lines.
7.5 million calls. And these are people calling in because they're having severe issues. They're right on that verge anyway. And so the services that they were able to provide have obviously been working.
Well, but it goes beyond that. What we also know is we have ambivalence. So with cops, so CopLine was never set up to be a suicide hotline because I felt that we would miss so many rudders into the etiology of what becomes a suicide. If we don't open these lines to deal with stressors that cops go through, have a safe place to talk, to unload without fear of it costing them their career, anybody knowing or anything else, then there's no reason for me to do this. Cops don't call suicide hotlines. And cops don't typically think they're suicidal unless they have a gun in one hand and a bottle of Jack in the other.
Yeah. And I joked at the beginning when we started talking, I said that, I probably should have called the line a couple of times myself. And I never felt or thought that I was anywhere near suicidal levels. But I do remember being so stressed and frustrated. And I remember anger being a big part of things, getting very angry about silly things, whether it be at work or at home or in my personal life, and not having somebody to share that with and talk through that was very difficult. And I didn't want to talk to my family about it because, I'm supposed to protect them from those types of things, and they weren't the cause of this, and I don't want them to hurt because of this. So I know that those were struggles that I went through, and I wish now that I had known of or had opportunities to talk to somebody that I thought would understand. Blue Canary is here to help you tell your stories, and I couldn't do that without the help of some very generous sponsors. Let's take a quick break to hear from one.
Help your team rise to increasing expectations with Agency 360's cloud-based software. Whether it is for the training of new employees or annual performance evaluations, Agency 360 can help trainers and supervisors streamline documentation, create consistency, and communicate clearly. Help retention by setting the tone and culture early with Agency 360. Learn more at agency360.com. That's AGENCY 360.com.
So people always ask, I really believe that most people are full of shit and they sensationalize numbers. And I think they sensationalize numbers a lot of times for funding. So when the decision was made to truly keep this line confidential, to make sure that whatever information that we had, we could protect, that we made sure that we could do so. We don't take any government money. We take zero. We don't apply for grants. We don't apply for any type of government fund. So no state, no federal.
So nobody's got their hooks in you.
Right. Because, and they should, when somebody gives you money, you have you're tasked with obviously showing them that it's being used for what it should be used for. I have no problem. I mean, everybody should go on and look at our 990 form, which is the not-for-profit. It's not that we're hiding money or we're doing anything we shouldn't be. I just don't want anybody that can potentially get into records that they shouldn't be able to get into. So we don't even care if you called up the line, Steve, and you said, person answers, and it's, typically, CopLine, this is Bob, what's going on? That eventually, if you don't say your name, they would say, can I have a name to call you by? And you can choose to be Sam. We don't care. It's not about that. It's about that connection. It's about being able to have somebody on the other end, that you are never alone. That is the message. So no matter how small an issue to truly a full-blown mental health crisis, that there is somebody on the other end 24 hours a day, 7 days a week that has given up their time to do this. And it is with such honor. So because we are not a rich group, so our trainings are our largest expenses every year, but we don't pay for any of the volunteers to go through it. So it's a 45-hour training.
your call takers are all they've all been experienced police officers.
Absolutely. So the minimum requirements. So if you go online and you filled out an application, you would see minimum requirement is that you had to have 10 years of full-time active duty, that you retired in good standings. You know, a lot of our guys have been hostage negotiators, peer support, et cetera, and they think that's beneficial. So we're not on those lines giving advice. Now try and train out giving advice to a cop.
Right.
So we don't give advice, and we are able to help them literally sit in a hole with them so they're not alone, and help them to understand what it is that they're going through. You know, cops are bright. You know, they get it. They don't talk to people. They don't want to be judged, and they don't want to be told what to do. Who the hell does? And so the men and women that we have trained on CopLine have gone through an incredibly difficult, rigorous 45 hours. And I will share with you that we've now completed 10 classes. Of the 10 classes that we have completed, there have only been 3 classes where everybody that was initially vetted ended up completing the course and answering, and everybody answered the lines. And most of that is through just self-exclusion, is that they realize this is really intense, that they might not want to volunteer to have, you know, their worst day on the job re-experienced potentially.
What kind of a toll does this take on the call takers by, as you said, reliving maybe even some of their own personal events again?
So it's a great question, and obviously, you know, we will open up all call takers to you because they would be the best people to answer that question. But I'll answer it and then I'll back up on it. They have found it to be the most rewarding experience. If I tell you that the text messages that I get are just so heartwarming for me, because when you set up something, and though I believed, you know, I had a vision, as I said the other night to my husband, I don't think I ever really had a vision that would be international, but I had always hoped that it would do exactly what it's doing. I always say to guys before they volunteer, I said, you know how you sign up for stuff when you're on the job and you signed up for a course and you got there and it was never what you thought it would be? They're like, yep. I'm like, well, CopLine is exactly what you think it's going to be. Like your greatest surprise is this is exactly what it is. You know, when you guys leave the job, cops don't miss the political bullshit. They don't miss the worrying about the internal strife. What they miss is helping each other. It is the true sense of giving, kind of going back to when you first took the job, what was good, what you had hoped for. CopLine appears to be that for these officers, for these retired officers, that they are helping the exact population that they wanted, which is law enforcement and their families. And they are truly making a difference. And, you know, after so many years on the job, and many times thankless job, is what they love and they're not used to is the people that are calling in are so appreciative that somebody was there for them. It was just, that's what it was about. So, you know, so when they get the tough calls, I have made sure, so there's always clinical backup for the officers that are answering the calls. And it's rare. But being able, I tell the guys, I'm like, just so you know, I am not the cop shrink to the entire country. It's just you guys. So don't be, oh yeah, no, I can get her. I got somebody right now. So that's been awesome. And I will typically check in. So there's normally a very small blurb that's written about a call, just so another call taker will know in case the person, you know, calls back, or, you know, kind of like you used to do when you're on the job. You kind of went through the calls of the past week or whatever to get a flavor of what's going on, particularly after the George Floyd, which I will address. So I will typically review that. And like, I'll give you a for instance. So this morning I had read one of the call takers thing and I just wrote, great call. So I texted, first thing in the morning, and he said, thanks, Steph. And I said, you've come a long way. It's delightful to watch you grow. And he said, it's very satisfying. I recall Lisa saying, the more you do, the easier it gets. It's got to be so hard to be a cop today. So that's typical. So that answers your question.
Yeah, and actually, as you brought that up, are you seeing a rise in calls now with the things that are going on?
So I've been interviewed quite a bit after COVID, and this is where I call bullshit on a lot of different lines or what have you. Is COVID was and is difficult, but cops took the job knowing that they were going to have to deal with the invisible enemy. What cops never anticipated was becoming the enemy. So we saw a slight rise in COVID, more concerns about family than about themselves. But that really kind of tapered off when everybody wasn't dying when they got it. That just kind of became a new normal, a new invisible enemy. We'll deal with it, blah, blah, blah. After the George Floyd riots, we not only have seen a consistent uptick in the number of calls, but the content of calls have changed. And that is what is heartbreaking.
So what are they asking about now? What are they talking about now?
Feelings of helplessness, about fear of the public, about telling their wives, their kids, or whomever, do not wear anything that identifies police, take stuff off the cars, get thin blue lines off the cars, take down thin blue line flags. Disheartened that leadership in the department is not supporting them, that they are not able to do police work, the fear that if deadly force is needed, that they won't be able to do it out of fear of retaliatory actions, that these are not men and women that ever saw color, that they now are having to rethink things that they never thought about to begin with. So a lot of people talking about looking at other careers, which sucks. So that's been kind of the theme now for months. It's been wonderful because so many of our retired guys have lived through and worked the Los Angeles riots and riots, throughout the country. So that's been great for both parties, honestly, to be able to benefit from what's going on today. And really our retired guys being able to say, brother, hang in there. We've got your back. And I remember how crappy this felt.
I think that that's really interesting because, being in law enforcement for a long time, you find these things kind of move in cycles, and we aren't necessarily seeing things any different than we've seen other times, maybe a little more intense. Maybe we've got kind of a perfect storm of events taking place. But as you talk about Rodney King riots in 92 and some of those issues we were dealing with there, you go all the way back to the Watts riots if you want to and see some of those issues and problems. And we're just seeing them again, but it seems now maybe it's a little more intense. Do you think that might be because of the younger generations in law enforcement and the way in which they process and think things through differently?
The millennials?
Yeah, I didn't want to use the nasty word millennial, but yeah, the millennials.
So I'm going to give you the profile of a cop.
Okay.
So the typical profile of a cop is somebody who has grown up in crisis, does well in crisis, doesn't know how to live without crisis, somebody who has issues with a father figure or significant loss early in life, somebody who has history of abuse, emotional, physical, sexual, or neglect. Makes for a great cop, makes for a difficult home life. That has been a profile for decades. We also talk about the buzzwords of resiliency. I'm sure that you're now, as you're doing the mental health plunge, that the word resiliency comes up rather frequently. So either I should probably not have a license and not practice, or I have no idea what the fuck people are talking about with resiliency. Because I have never met a more resilient population than law enforcement in my entire lifetime. So resiliency is acquired by having gone through difficult times. It's the only way to build it. So if you have been in Mayberry, and the millennials won't even know where Mayberry is, unless they're watching Nick at Night, and now all of a sudden you take this job and you've been you've been in a 4-year institution of learning where you get to independently think and get indoctrinated into what I find to be an interesting, skewed culture, and that's who's now getting on the job. So what we find is that those that are resilient do well. And that is most of the police population. If you haven't been exposed to trauma, if you haven't been exposed to really much, the only thing you can really pull off of is what we call post-traumatic growth now. So I'll give you a good example, which I liked, that I had read, which was, so you're in California and you've gone through a whole ton of crap when you were growing up. You know that the world is shit, and you have survived every worst day of your life. So you know that you can survive the next worst day of your life because that's what you've done. And now all of a sudden, your neighbor, who has absolutely been skipping through life, has a great job, beautiful wife, 2 beautiful kids, a dog that doesn't bark. I mean, this is lovely. Now all of a sudden, earthquake hits, 8.6. It rattles the whole state. And you're sitting there as the officer, and you go into your location where you've got your to-go stuff, and you've got your MREs, you've got your water, you've got fire extinguishers, you've got battery operated or gas operated chainsaws. Like, you've been waiting your whole life for this. You're okay. Family's okay. Now you look outside and there's your neighbor who is pale as can be. His children are just wrapped in a ball. Wife, 1,000-yard stare. He is completely immobilized. And he's saying, I can't believe this happened. How could this happen? Whereas the cop's like, I've been waiting for this my whole life. This is okay. We can go from here. So it's really the difference of understanding what resilience is and being able to truly use it. But to be able to help law enforcement, we don't need to teach resiliency, for God's sakes. We need to help them understand how everything they have in their backgrounds is used to absolutely survive and thrive in what can be an insidious environment if dealt with properly. And the millennials, without that background, are going to end up dealing with post-traumatic growth. And if they can't grow from it, I worry about them tremendously. Everybody talks about that kind of, our mental health crisis in law enforcement is going to be solved by the millennials because they're more willing to get help, that they are a population that's been more indoctrinated into it's okay to ask for help, blah, blah, blah. I am not on that bandwagon. I could be proved wrong. I would love to be proved wrong. I see it actually the opposite. I see that they don't have a whole lot to grab from, and that if they cannot learn from what they're going to be experiencing, I think actually our suicide rates are going to be higher.
You said something earlier in our conversation that I wanted to come back to, and we've kind of touched on it again. You talked about the officers that are experiencing that are policing in their own neighborhoods where they grew up with the people that they met. And then you also talked about some of these experiences with millennials. Do you think that an officer who is policing in their own neighborhood where they grew up or their own city, are they more likely to suffer having some problems or less likely because of that?
Don't know. It'd be an interesting study. Very interesting study that would be done. So when I look at, I guess what one would look at then is, but to break it down into where the person grew up and if they were policing their own area, to look at something like that. So I don't know the answer.
Because I could see that being, I could see that being more difficult in some respects, but I could see it being easier in others. And so I would that's something that I thought was curious, as you said before, talking about that. This has been extremely enlightening. What is that CopLine number? What is the phone number?
So it's 1-800, and it spells out CopLine, but it is, so the numerical portion of CopLine is 267-5463.
But just remember 1-800-CopLine and you'll get there.
Absolutely.
And that's the story we have to tell. Thank you for joining. As always, I'm curious what questions you're getting asked. What isn't the news covering? What story needs to be told? Connect with me at bluecanarypodcast@gmail.com.